The morning started quietly, the kind of calm that makes you believe the day will stay ordinary. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Virginia suburbs, painting the sky with soft orange light. The streets were mostly empty except for a few early commuters and joggers. In the middle of that quiet morning, a black SUV moved slowly down a narrow road leading toward a small gas station. Inside the car sat the FBI director, a man who had spent decades serving his country, someone used to control and order. But that morning he wasn't thinking about work. He was dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, hoping to grab a cup of coffee before heading home from an early meeting. He stopped at the gas station, parked near the corner, and stepped out to stretch his legs. He looked like any other man getting fuel, not the head of one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. He nodded politely to the station clerk through the glass door and started filling his tank. The sound of the fuel pump was the only thing breaking the morning silence. A few seconds later, he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser slowed down and stopped right behind his car. Two officers stepped out. They were from the local department, not federal agents. The director thought nothing of it at first. Maybe they were just passing by, maybe checking something nearby. But when one officer began walking directly toward him, hand resting on his belt, the calm of the morning began to fade. The officer called out sharply, asking him to show his driver's license and registration. There was no greeting, no explanation. The tone was firm, almost accusing. The director raised his eyebrows but stayed polite. He explained that he had done nothing wrong and that he was just fueling his car. The officer didn't seem to care. The other officer, standing near the cruiser, watched closely, hand resting near his holster as if waiting for a reason to act. Trying to keep the situation calm, the director opened the door and reached slowly for his wallet. He explained his movements as he did it, the way someone experienced with police procedure would. He handed over his license, keeping his voice even and steady. The first officer snatched it, glanced at it briefly, then frowned. It was clear he didn't recognize the name or the face in front of him. The tension began to rise. The director asked why he was being stopped. The officer gave a vague answer about a vehicle matching the description of a suspect's car. The director looked at his vehicle, a government-issued SUV, spotless with federal plates, and realized something was off. He could tell these officers weren't interested in facts. They were acting on assumption or maybe something else. A few customers nearby began to watch. The director could feel their eyes on him. He remained calm, his years of training reminding him not to escalate. But inside he felt a quiet frustration building. He had trained hundreds of officers on proper conduct. He had spoken countless times about respect and accountability. Now he stood on the receiving end of the very behavior he worked to change. One of the officers suddenly ordered him to step away from the vehicle. The director hesitated, then followed the instruction, raising his hand slightly. The officer began questioning him in a louder, more aggressive tone. The other officer walked around the SUV, shining a flashlight into the windows even though it was morning. The director told them calmly that there was no need for this. He even offered to show his credentials to confirm who he was. But the officer didn't want to hear it. People were starting to take out their phones. The tension had become visible to anyone passing by. The director could sense where this was heading. Still, he kept his composure. He knew one wrong word could make things worse. He tried again to explain that he was a federal official, but the officer cut him off, telling him to be quiet. At that moment, something inside him shifted. It wasn't fear, but disappointment. He thought about all the years he had spent building trust between local and federal agencies. He thought about the young officers he had mentored, the programs he had created to prevent exactly this kind of misunderstanding. Now none of that seemed to matter. The uniform in front of him didn't see the person, just a man to control. Then the unexpected happened. The officer asked him to turn around. Before the director could fully process it, the officer grabbed his wrist and placed it behind his back. The sound of metal clicking filled the air. Handcuffs. The director stood still, stunned. The gas pump had stopped running and the whole world seemed to pause for a second. The few people watching gasped softly, unsure what they were seeing. A man who had spent his life upholding the law was now being treated as if he had broken it. The officer said he was being detained for questioning. No explanation, no courtesy. The director didn't resist. He knew how these situations could spiral. He simply looked at the ground and took a slow breath. Inside, he was calm but deeply disappointed. He had been through intense field operations, hostage negotiations, and security threats, but nothing compared to standing there powerless, while being misunderstood by the very people sworn to serve and protect. One of the officers radioed something in, speaking quickly. The other began checking the SUV again, peering into the glove compartment. They had no warrant, no reason, but the director didn't argue. He knew the truth would surface soon. He also knew that arguing now would only make things worse. Minutes passed. The station clerk peeked through the window, unsure what to do. The bystanders whispered among themselves. The flashing lights kept spinning, painting the parking lot in red and blue. Time seemed to slow down. The officer holding the radio turned back toward the director. He asked again where he was coming from, what his business was, why he was driving a government vehicle. The director answered plainly, still calm. He even mentioned that he was returning from an early briefing. But the officers didn't believe him. To them, he was just a man with a story. The director wondered what might have caused this. Maybe his car matched a description. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, he could sense something else, a mix of pride and prejudice in the air. The way the officer looked at him, the way he ignored his credentials, the way he seemed determined to find something wrong. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about control. The director didn't raise his voice or argue. He knew that staying calm was the only way out. He stood still, breathing slowly, waiting for reason to return to the moment. The world around him felt distant. He could hear the sound of passing cars, the soft hum of the gas pumps, the faint chatter of onlookers. Everything seemed normal, yet nothing was. One of the officers walked over and said they were going to take him to the station for more questioning. That's when the director finally spoke firmly. He told them again to look closely at his identification. The officer hesitated, then pulled the ID from his pocket and glanced at it. The expression on his face changed slightly, a flicker of doubt, maybe realization, but he quickly hid it and told the other officer to proceed. The director was led toward the cruiser. He walked quietly, the handcuffs cold against his wrists. He didn't resist, didn't plead. Inside, he was thinking about how quickly control could shift, how easily authority could be misused. He wasn't angry, just deeply reflective. He wondered how many others had faced the same feeling, that helplessness when you know the truth but no one wants to hear it. As he sat in the back seat of the cruiser, he looked out through the tinted glass. The sky was brighter now, the sun fully up. Life outside moved on, people fueling their cars, sipping coffee, checking their phones. No one knew that inside that car sat the FBI director, silently observing the world he had dedicated his life to protecting. The ride to the station was short but heavy with silence. The officers didn't speak much. The director didn't ask questions. He simply watched the road, every turn, every sign, every tree passing by. His mind was calm but alert. He knew this wasn't over. Somewhere deep inside, he also knew that truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how people try to hide it. By the time they pulled into the small local precinct, the director had already decided one thing. He would handle this with the same patience and discipline he had shown his entire career. He would let the facts speak for themselves, and when they did, the people responsible would have to face what they had done. But for now, he remained quiet. The door opened and he stepped out, the cold morning air brushing against his face. He looked up at the station sign, took a deep breath, and walked inside, still handcuffed, still calm, still believing in the system he had built, even if, for the moment, that system had failed him. The room inside the small local station was cold and quiet. The walls were lined with old notice boards and faded posters about safety. The FBI director sat on a hard chair near a metal table. His wrists still hurt slightly from the handcuffs that had just been removed. Two officers stood near the door, whispering to each other. Their voices were low, but the tone carried a mix of uncertainty and arrogance. He sat still, his face calm, but his mind was sharp. Years of experience in interrogation rooms had taught him how to read people, and he could sense the unease behind the officers' tough appearance. They didn't know who they were dealing with yet. They believed they had just detained another man they could question freely. The director decided not to reveal his position immediately. He wanted to see how far they would go. One of the officers finally spoke. He asked again for the director's name, where he was coming from, and what business he had in town. The director answered each question clearly and politely, using the same calm tone. But it didn't seem to matter. The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. The other one stood near the corner, crossing his arms, looking impatient. They began to ask about the vehicle he was driving. It was a government SUV, black, with official tags. The officers asked why he was using it. The director replied simply that it was assigned to him. They didn't believe it. Instead, one of them smirked, suggesting that he might have borrowed or stolen it. The director said nothing for a moment, just looked at the man in silence. That quiet look made the room even more tense. The younger officer broke the silence, saying they were waiting for confirmation from dispatch about the car. The director nodded slightly. He didn't argue. He knew that within a few minutes the truth would surface. But what bothered him wasn't the delay, it was the attitude. The lack of respect. The way these men handled their duty without care or fairness. He thought about the many police departments across the country he had worked with. He had spent years building trust between local and federal agencies, encouraging cooperation and discipline. He knew most officers did their jobs honorably, risking their lives daily. But he had also seen a few who misused their badge, treating people based on assumption instead of truth. Sitting in that room now, he felt that painful contrast. A third officer entered the room carrying a cup of coffee. He didn't speak to the director but handed the cup to his colleague. Then, glancing at the man sitting calmly at the table, he muttered something under his breath. The director caught only a few words, something about thinking he's important. He ignored it. He wasn't there to argue or defend his pride. He was there to observe. Minutes passed slowly. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. The director kept his hands on the table, fingers lightly tapping the surface. The officers continued to move around the room, occasionally checking their phones or whispering near the door. Their lack of professionalism was striking. Finally, the senior officer returned. He held the director's ID in his hand. He looked at it, then at the man sitting before him and said, "This doesn't look right. You expect us to believe you work for the Bureau?" His tone carried disbelief and a hint of mockery. The director responded calmly, saying that the identification was official and could be verified with one call to the federal office. Instead of calling, the officer laughed and said, "We'll see about that." The director leaned back slightly in his chair, taking a slow breath. His patience was deep but not endless. He thought about the message this kind of behavior sent to ordinary people, how easily power could be misused when unchecked. He didn't feel angry, just disappointed. He had seen corruption and arrogance before, but facing it personally gave him a new perspective. The officers stepped out of the room for a brief moment. The director could hear them talking in the hallway. Their words weren't clear, but their tone was. They were confident, even careless. He knew they didn't yet understand who he was or the seriousness of their mistake. Still, he chose not to reveal it. He wanted to see whether any of them would act with integrity before the truth came out. When they came back in, the officer with the coffee leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He began to ask the same questions again: where he lived, what his job was, why he was in the area. It was as if they were trying to catch him in a lie. The director answered each time calmly, consistently. His voice never rose. His body language stayed composed. But inside, he was taking note of every detail: their tone, their words, their choices. One of the officers suddenly mentioned something that caught his attention. He said, "Look, we could make this easier for you. People don't always need to know what happens here if you cooperate." The words were slow and deliberate. The director's eyes lifted slightly. He understood the meaning behind them. It wasn't an offer, it was pressure. They were testing him, maybe trying to intimidate him, maybe trying to gain something. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "I always cooperate with the law." The officer smiled faintly but said nothing more. The air in the room grew heavier. The director could feel the situation crossing from a misunderstanding into something more concerning. But still, he remained patient. His years of service had taught him that sometimes silence could reveal more than words. He thought about his family for a brief moment, how he had promised them that his job, though dangerous, always followed a code of fairness and discipline. He wondered what they would think if they saw him there now, sitting quietly in a chair, treated like a suspect. He felt no fear, only resolve. He knew that the truth was a few minutes away. A phone rang somewhere outside the room. The sound echoed faintly through the hall. One of the officers stepped out to answer it. The director watched through the small glass window in the door. He saw the officer's face change slightly during the call, eyes widening, posture stiffening. Then he turned to look toward the room where the director sat. The call was short. The officer hung up quickly and whispered something to his partner. The director could tell something had shifted. The officers looked at each other, uncertain now. One of them picked up the ID again, studying it more carefully. He asked quietly, "What if this is real?" The other shrugged but didn't answer. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Still, no one apologized or admitted a mistake. They didn't release him right away either. They hesitated, unsure how to handle what was becoming clear. The director stayed calm, letting them find out on their own. He had no intention of saving them from their own choices. A few more minutes passed before another call came in. This time it was louder, more urgent. The officer who answered spoke quickly, his tone shifting from confident to nervous. He nodded several times, then looked back toward the interrogation room with a pale expression. Something was about to change. Inside, the director sat quietly, still as a statue. He didn't smile, didn't react. He just waited. He had always believed that truth revealed itself in silence, and in that silence he could almost feel the balance of power shifting. The officers who had controlled the situation a few minutes ago were now uncertain, even afraid. He could hear them talking hurriedly outside the room now. Words like headquarters and verification slipped through the door. One of them mentioned urgent confirmation. The director knew exactly what that meant. The federal office had likely identified his vehicle and noticed irregular activity in the tracking system. It wouldn't take long before his status was fully confirmed. Still, the officers hesitated to come back inside. They stood in the hallway, whispering nervously. The director glanced at the clock again. Barely 6 minutes had passed since the first call came in. 6 minutes that would change everything. He sat quietly, reflecting on how fragile perception could be, how quickly respect and judgment could shift depending on what someone believed about you. These officers had treated him with suspicion and disrespect because they didn't know his title. Soon they would learn it, and then everything about their tone, their posture, their words would change. But he didn't take comfort in that. He felt sadness instead, because true respect should never depend on rank or power. He leaned back in the chair, breathing evenly, watching the door. The next few moments would decide what kind of men these officers really were. Would they admit their mistake? Would they apologize? Or would they try to cover it up? He didn't know yet, but he was ready to see the truth. The hallway fell silent again. Then the sound of hurried footsteps approached. The door opened slightly and the senior officer peeked in, his face pale and uneasy. He started to say something, but the words stumbled out of his mouth. The director met his eyes, calm and steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth had already begun to surface, and the room felt heavier than ever. The next few minutes would reveal more than any interrogation could. It would show what kind of character these men truly had, and how quickly power could turn into regret. The silence in the small room was heavy, as if every sound had been swallowed by the walls. The FBI director sat still, waiting, watching the uneasy movement of the officers outside the door. The tension in the air had changed completely. Moments ago, they had been confident and dismissive. Now they were whispering nervously, their expressions showing a quiet fear that they couldn't hide anymore. The senior officer entered the room again, holding the director's ID in his shaking hand. He cleared his throat and spoke softly this time, trying to sound calm. He said there had been a small mix-up and that everything would be sorted out soon. The director didn't reply. He simply looked at him, his face unreadable. The officer avoided his eyes, glancing down at the table instead. Another officer entered the room, pretending to check the computer screen on the desk. He mumbled something about confirming some information, though it was clear they already knew the truth. The air felt thick with guilt. The director could see the change in their behavior. The arrogance was gone, replaced by quiet panic. He could almost hear their thoughts. They were trying to figure out how to fix the situation before it went any further, but it was too late. The call from headquarters had already been made. The system had identified his vehicle and his position. They knew exactly who was sitting in that small room, and that knowledge carried a weight that was now pressing down on everyone in the building. The director leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. He spoke for the first time in several minutes. His voice was calm, steady, and quiet. He asked, "Am I free to go?" The officer stuttered slightly before answering. He said, "Just a moment, sir. We're handling some paperwork." It was strange hearing the word "sir" now after how they had treated him earlier. The shift in tone was sharp and revealing. The director didn't move. He didn't argue. He knew the next few moments would say more than anything else. He wanted to see how they would handle the truth now that they knew it. Minutes passed. The younger officer stepped out of the room again, and voices echoed faintly from the hallway. There was talk of someone from the federal office calling directly. The director could tell that this was turning into something much bigger than these officers had imagined. When the younger officer came back in, his tone was completely different. He spoke with forced politeness, saying they had confirmed his identity and that there had been a misunderstanding. He added that they were sorry for the confusion. The words sounded rehearsed, uncomfortable. The director nodded slightly but said nothing. He had heard apologies like that before, apologies born out of fear, not sincerity. They uncuffed him fully and offered him water, trying to ease the tension. He declined politely. The senior officer began to explain that they were only following procedure, that there had been a report about a suspicious vehicle. The director listened without interrupting. He wanted to hear every word. The officer kept talking, stumbling over his sentences, trying to sound professional. When he finished, the director spoke quietly. He said, "Procedure is about fairness, not assumptions." His voice wasn't loud, but the weight of the words filled the room. The officer nodded quickly, unable to respond. Just then, the door opened again and a man in a dark suit walked in. He wasn't local law enforcement. His presence changed everything instantly. The officers straightened up. The man introduced himself as a liaison from the bureau. He looked at the director, gave a respectful nod, then turned sharply to the officers. His expression was serious, his tone controlled. He said they had made a very serious mistake. The officers tried to explain, but the man in the suit stopped them with a raised hand. He said he would handle it from there. The director stood up slowly, his posture calm but commanding. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The same officers who had once spoken to him harshly now couldn't meet his eyes. As the director stepped toward the door, one of the officers spoke softly, almost whispering. He said, "We didn't know, sir." The director paused and looked at him. His face remained calm, but his voice carried quiet authority. He said, "You should treat everyone as if you do." Then he turned and walked out of the room. The hallway outside was filled with quiet movement. A few local officers had gathered, whispering about what was happening. The director walked past them without saying a word. The man in the suit followed closely, speaking quietly into a phone. Within minutes, 2 black federal vehicles pulled up outside the station. The director stepped out into the cool morning air. The same sunlight that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt heavy with irony. He looked around the parking lot, the same place where this had all started. The gas station was visible in the distance. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that moment. The bureau agents approached quickly, greeting him with professionalism and concern. One of them offered to escort him back to headquarters. The director nodded slightly but didn't get in the car right away. He turned back toward the station, his eyes resting briefly on the officers watching from the window. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised anymore. But he was disappointed deeply. What had happened wasn't just about him. It was about something larger. It was about how people in power could forget their responsibility, how they could misuse authority without even realizing the harm they caused. He took a slow breath, then finally got into the car. The door closed softly and the vehicle started moving. The road ahead stretched out quietly, the sound of the engine filling the silence. The agent driving looked straight ahead, choosing not to speak unless spoken to. The director stared out the window, his reflection faintly visible against the passing trees. He thought about how quickly a situation could turn from calm to dangerous. If he hadn't been who he was, if he hadn't stayed patient, the outcome could have been very different. That thought stayed with him. It wasn't anger, it was realization. He had seen injustice before, but this time it had touched him personally. Back at headquarters, he was greeted by several senior agents who already knew what had happened. They asked if he wanted to file an official complaint. The director shook his head. He said quietly that this wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about change. He wanted a report, yes, but one that focused on training, reform, and better communication between agencies. He knew that incidents like this weren't rare. Many people had faced worse without the power or authority to defend themselves. He thought of them as he sat in his office, the large windows letting in the light of the late morning. He didn't want this story to be about embarrassment or blame. He wanted it to become a reason for something better. He called for a meeting with the regional law enforcement leadership. He wanted to discuss new guidelines, ones that emphasized respect and accountability. The people in the room listened carefully, their expressions serious. They understood that this wasn't a small issue anymore. It had grown into a matter of trust and integrity. Later that day, the director sat alone for a while, looking at the city from his window. The skyline was calm, the streets below moving with the rhythm of everyday life. It was strange how quickly things could shift. One morning, he was just another man stopping for gas. Hours later, he had become the center of a story that would soon reach every department in the country. He didn't want to think about the officers with bitterness. He thought instead about how easily people could lose their way when they forgot why they had chosen to serve. He hoped they would learn from it, truly learn, not just because of fear, but because they understood the weight of what they represented. As evening approached, he received a call from a colleague asking how he was doing. He said he was fine, just thoughtful. He didn't mention the details. He didn't need to. The silence between the words carried enough meaning. Before leaving the office, he opened his notebook and wrote a short line to remind himself, respect should never depend on recognition. He closed the notebook, placed it on his desk, and turned off the light. Outside, the city lights flickered on. The air was cool, calm, and quiet again, just like the morning had been. But the world wasn't quite the same. The director knew that even a few minutes could reveal the truth about people, their choices, their values, their courage. And though the day had left a heavy mark, it also renewed his purpose. He walked toward his car, not the same one from that morning, but another waiting near the entrance. The driver opened the door for him, but he paused for a moment before getting in. He looked at the stars beginning to appear above the buildings and thought about how quickly control could turn into humility. Then, with a steady breath, he got in the car and quietly drove away, ready to face what came next. The next morning came quietly, but the world around the FBI director was far from calm. The incident from the day before had already reached several news outlets, though few details were public. The Bureau's communication team was trying to control the story, but the truth was spreading faster than expected. Inside the main office, people moved with a quiet sense of urgency. No one wanted to say much, but everyone knew something serious had happened. The director arrived at the building earlier than usual. He walked through the hallway without saying much, nodding politely to those he passed. People greeted him respectfully, but their eyes carried questions they were afraid to ask. He understood their silence. They all knew he had been through something no one in his position should have experienced. Inside his office, the morning light poured through the window. He stood there for a while, looking out at the city below. The streets looked peaceful, but he knew how fragile that peace could be. One misunderstanding, one act of arrogance could change everything in a moment. He had lived it firsthand. His assistant knocked softly and entered with a folder. It contained reports from the internal investigation that had started overnight. The Bureau wanted to make sure every detail was documented. The director opened the file and read through the notes. It described the timeline of events, from the traffic stop to the moment federal agents arrived at the station. Every second had been accounted for. As he read, his mind drifted back to those tense minutes in the interrogation room, the faces of the officers, their tone, the silence that followed when they realized who he was. It still didn't sit right with him. He didn't want this to become a story of punishment. He wanted it to become a story of learning, a moment that pushed people to be better. He placed the folder down and sat quietly for a while. The sound of the clock on the wall filled the room. He wasn't thinking about anger or revenge. He was thinking about responsibility. As the head of the bureau, he carried the weight of example. How he handled this would matter not just for himself, but for everyone who looked up to him. A few minutes later, he called for a meeting with his senior team. When they gathered, the air in the conference room felt heavy. No one spoke at first. The director started by thanking them for their support, then went straight to the point. He said what happened wasn't just a personal matter. It was a reflection of a larger issue. He talked about how law enforcement had to be built on trust, not power. He reminded them that every officer, regardless of rank, should treat people with respect. His words were simple, but they carried meaning. Everyone in the room listened carefully. They knew he was speaking from personal experience, and that made every word stronger. He wasn't reading from a report or giving a lecture. He was speaking from the heart. He asked his team to prepare a plan, a program that would strengthen cooperation and training between local and federal agencies. He wanted workshops that focused on communication, ethics, and community understanding. He wanted officers to see people, not suspects. He wanted respect to become the rule, not the exception. One of the senior agents asked if he planned to press charges against the officers involved. The director paused for a moment, then shook his head. He said, "No, this isn't about destroying people's careers. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." His tone was firm but calm. Everyone understood his message. He believed in justice, but he also believed in growth. After the meeting, he returned to his office. The day continued with calls and briefings, but part of his mind stayed with what had happened. Around midday, he received a message that the local police department wanted to arrange a private meeting. They wanted to apologize in person. The director agreed, though he didn't expect much. He wasn't looking for apologies, he wanted understanding. Later that afternoon, 3 local officers arrived at the bureau headquarters, escorted by a liaison. They looked nervous as they entered his office. The director stood to greet them. He didn't make them feel small. Instead, he spoke kindly, gesturing for them to sit. The senior officer was the first to speak. His voice trembled slightly as he said that they were sorry for what happened. He said they hadn't recognized him, and that they had made assumptions they shouldn't have. The director listened without interrupting. He could tell the words were sincere, but they were also heavy with guilt. When the man finished, the director spoke softly. He said, "I understand mistakes can happen. What matters is what you learn from them." He looked each of them in the eyes as he spoke. "You wear that badge for a reason. It's not just authority, it's trust. Every time you act, you show people what justice looks like. Don't forget that." The room was silent for a few seconds. One of the younger officers nodded slowly. Another lowered his eyes. The director didn't raise his voice or lecture them. His calmness carried more weight than anger ever could. Before they left, he said something that stayed with them. "It's easy to respect someone when you know who they are. The real test is respecting those you don't." The officers left quietly, humbled. The director sat back in his chair, feeling a mix of exhaustion and peace. It wasn't easy to stay calm in moments like that, but he knew that real leadership meant staying composed even when others failed to do the same. Over the next few days, the incident continued to circulate in media circles. Commentators spoke about it as an example of the challenges within the justice system. Some praised the director's patience, others criticized the local department. The director didn't make any public statements. He believed that sometimes silence spoke louder than speeches. Behind the scenes, though, he worked tirelessly. He directed his team to launch a new campaign focusing on professionalism and fairness. He wanted every officer in the field to remember why they chose this path in the first place. It wasn't about control, it was about service. One evening, he attended a quiet meeting with community leaders from around the city. They thanked him for handling the situation with grace. They said his calm response had restored some faith in the system. The director appreciated their words but reminded them that one good act couldn't erase years of distrust. Real change, he said, would come from consistent effort and open dialogue. As the days passed, the noise around the story began to fade, but its lessons remained. The officers involved were placed in additional training programs. The Bureau's reform initiative gained attention across multiple states. Slowly, what began as a moment of humiliation was turning into a movement for better understanding and respect. One morning, the director received a letter. It was handwritten, something rare in his position. It was from one of the officers who had been there that day. The letter thanked him for his patience and admitted that the experience had changed the officer's perspective forever. The man wrote that he now understood how easily pride could cloud judgment, and that he was determined to do better. The director read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer. He didn't need recognition, but reading those words reminded him that even painful moments could lead to growth. That evening, as he left the building, he paused for a moment outside. The air was cool, and the city lights reflected softly on the pavement. He thought about how much had changed in just a few days. What had started as an unfair moment had turned into a lesson that reached far beyond him. He smiled faintly, not out of pride, but out of quiet relief. He had seen the worst of situations turn into opportunities for change before, but this time it felt personal. It reminded him why he had chosen this life in the first place, not for power or status, but to make sure justice truly meant fairness. As he walked to his car, he thought about all the people who faced similar situations every day, people without the influence or protection he had. He wanted to make sure the system worked for them too. That thought stayed with him long after he got home. When he finally sat down at his desk that night, he opened his notebook again and wrote another line. True power is not in control, it's in restraint. He underlined it once, then closed the book gently. Outside, the city was quiet again. The events of the past days had left their mark, but they had also sparked change. The director knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but he also knew that progress often started with discomfort. And as long as he could keep that lesson alive in others, the pain of that morning would never be wasted. Days passed and life at the bureau seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, but underneath the calm surface, things were different. The director could feel it in the way people talked, the way they listened more carefully, the way respect seemed to carry a new meaning. The event that had shaken him was quietly shaping the culture inside the organization. He didn't have to force it. People simply understood that something important had happened. One morning, as he reviewed his schedule, his assistant told him that he had been invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. It would be a gathering of senior officials, police chiefs, and community representatives from all over the country. The theme of the conference was unity and reform. The invitation letter mentioned that the organizers wanted him to share his recent experience, not the details of the incident, but the lessons it had taught him. He thought for a moment before agreeing. It wasn't easy to revisit those memories, but he knew this was a chance to turn something personal into something powerful. If his story could make even a few people think differently, it would be worth it. The conference was scheduled 2 weeks later in Washington. As the day approached, his team helped him prepare notes, but he didn't want a scripted speech. He told them he preferred to speak from the heart. He had lived through it. There was no need for perfect words, just honest ones. When the day came, the hall was filled with hundreds of people. Cameras lined the back wall and reporters sat ready with their notepads. The director walked to the podium with his usual calm. The audience stood and applauded before he even spoke. He nodded politely, waited for the noise to settle, and began. He started by talking about his years in service, about how he had seen the system from both the top and the ground. He said he had always believed in fairness, but recently, he had been reminded that even those who lead can face moments of unfairness. He didn't share every detail, but his voice carried the weight of truth. He spoke about respect, the kind that doesn't depend on titles or uniforms. He talked about how easy it is to forget the human side of law enforcement when pressure and pride take over. The room was silent, every word sinking in. He told them how in one short moment, assumptions had replaced understanding and how quickly things could go wrong when that happens. As he spoke, he didn't sound angry or bitter. He sounded thoughtful, even hopeful. He said, "We can't change the past, but we can change what we learn from it." He reminded everyone that the goal of justice was not control, but fairness. That true strength came from humility. When he finished, the room erupted in applause again, louder this time. Many people stood up. Some looked emotional. Afterward, several officials approached him to thank him for his honesty. They said his words had struck a chord. One police chief said he planned to start similar training in his department immediately. That evening, as he sat in his hotel room, The director looked out at the city skyline. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride but peace. He knew change was slow, but he also knew it always started with awareness. And for the first time since the incident, he felt that something good had truly come from it. A few days later, he returned to his office and found a large envelope on his desk. It was filled with letters, some from officers, some from civilians, and some from students studying law enforcement. They all thanked him for speaking openly, for showing that even those in power could be vulnerable and still choose understanding over anger. He spent the afternoon reading each letter. Some were only a few lines long, others several pages. One came from a young officer who said he had once stopped someone unfairly and had never forgotten the look on that person's face. The letter said, "I realized I had become someone I never wanted to be. Your story reminded me that respect isn't optional. It's part of the job." The director folded that letter and kept it in his briefcase. He wanted to remember that message for himself too. Weeks passed and the Bureau's reform program began to take shape. Officers from all over the country signed up for new courses focused on empathy, communication, and community engagement. The director made sure the training wasn't just about procedures but about people, about listening, about restraint, about patience. During one session, he attended quietly in the back, watching new recruits go through scenario-based training. He saw them handle mock situations with calm and care, practicing how to de-escalate instead of dominate. Seeing that filled him with hope. This was what he had wanted, to see the next generation learning from mistakes that had come before them. Outside the Bureau, the public reaction was also changing. The incident that once could have been another divisive headline had become a conversation starter about fairness and leadership. News articles focused on how he had handled the situation rather than what had gone wrong. Editorials praised his decision to forgive rather than punish. Even critics who had initially doubted his approach began to admit that his patience had done more good than anger ever could. One afternoon, he was invited to meet with a group of community activists who had been skeptical of law enforcement for years. They wanted to hear directly from him. When he arrived at the small community center, the mood was cautious. People there had experienced pain, discrimination, and mistrust. But when he spoke, he didn't defend the system. Instead, he acknowledged its flaws. He said, "Change doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It comes from admitting where we failed and doing better." His honesty surprised them. Slowly, the tension in the room eased. People began to ask questions, not accusations. It turned into a real conversation, a rare thing between law enforcement and the public. By the end of the meeting, several community members shook his hand. One elderly man told him, "You gave me something I thought I'd lost, a bit of faith." Driving back to his office, the director thought about those words. Faith. It was fragile, but powerful. It took years to build and only seconds to lose. But that day, he felt it returning piece by piece. Back at the Bureau, his assistant brought him an update about the local police department involved in the original incident. They had implemented their own internal training inspired by his new program. The director was pleased but said nothing. He didn't need credit. He just wanted results. That night, as he reviewed his notes, he thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If he had reacted with anger, if he had demanded punishment, maybe none of this progress would have happened. It reminded him that leadership wasn't about power, it was about perspective. The next morning, he took a walk around the Bureau building before the day began. The early light gave the city a calm glow. He passed by several agents who greeted him warmly. One younger agent stopped him and said, "Sir, I just wanted to thank you for how you handled everything. It changed the way a lot of us think." The director smiled and nodded, grateful for the quiet acknowledgement. As days turned into weeks, his focus shifted toward ensuring that the lessons learned wouldn't fade with time. He created a committee to review interactions between federal and local officers regularly. He wanted communication to be open, consistent, and respectful at every level. In one of the committee's first reports, they shared that complaints had already started to decrease in several departments that adopted the new training. Officers were approaching situations differently, taking more time to listen and avoiding unnecessary conflict. It was a small but meaningful start. The director kept a journal through this time. Each night he wrote short reflections, lessons from the day, thoughts about leadership, reminders to stay grounded. One entry read, Respect isn't earned by fear. It's earned by fairness. Another said, people will forget your rank, but they'll remember how you made them feel. He didn't plan to publish the journal, but one day, maybe, he hoped to share it with new recruits. It wasn't about rules or laws. It was about humanity, the one thing that connected everyone, no matter their title or uniform. By the end of that month, the Bureau released an internal video where the director spoke briefly about the values that guided their work. He didn't mention the incident, but anyone who had followed his journey could see how deeply it had shaped his message. His closing words were simple. Justice without respect isn't justice at all. The video spread quietly across departments and training academies. Officers began quoting his lines in their discussions. For many, it became a reminder that true strength lies not in control, but in compassion. The director knew there was still a long way to go. But as he looked around, he saw signs of real change, a softer tone in conversations, a greater sense of responsibility, a deeper awareness of what justice truly meant. And in those moments, he felt something rare in his line of work: hope. Months had passed since the day that had changed everything for the director. Life had returned to a calm rhythm, but something inside him had shifted forever. The way he saw his role, the way he approached people, even the way he carried himself, it all carried a quiet depth now. He had always believed in justice, but now he understood that justice wasn't just about laws and rules. It was about understanding hearts. The Bureau was thriving under his leadership. The new programs he started were showing visible results. Reports came in every week highlighting moments of restraint, respect, and compassion in the field. Officers who once handled situations with force were now learning to pause, to listen, to think before acting. Those changes might have seemed small to some, but to the director they meant the world. He often walked through the training facilities to watch new recruits during their exercises. He listened as instructors repeated lessons he had helped design. He could see the difference in the recruits' faces, their awareness, their patience. They were learning not just how to enforce the law, but how to protect people with dignity. Watching them made him feel like something truly good had grown out of that painful day. Still, every once in a while, he would remember the fear and humiliation he had felt during that encounter with the police. It wasn't something he could forget completely, but over time he had turned that memory into a kind of compass, a reminder of how easy it was to lose sight of humanity when pride and power got in the way. One morning, he received a letter marked confidential. It came from the local police department involved in the original incident. Inside was an invitation. They were hosting a ceremony to celebrate the completion of their new training program, a program they had modeled after the Bureau's reforms. They wanted him to attend as a guest of honor. He hesitated for a few seconds, not because of anger, but because he wanted to be sure his presence wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. But then he thought about it carefully. If he was serious about change, he had to face every part of the journey, including the past. He replied with a simple note of acceptance. A week later, he arrived at the small town's community center where the event was being held. The atmosphere was warm and respectful. Local officials, officers, and community members were gathered together. When he entered, the room went silent for a brief moment before everyone began to applaud. The police chief walked up to him and extended a hand. The director shook it firmly with a calm smile. The chief began the ceremony with a short speech about progress, humility, and growth. Then he invited the director to speak. The director walked up to the stage slowly, taking a deep breath before he began. His voice was steady and his words came naturally. He told them that he didn't come there as a federal officer, but as a fellow human being. He spoke about how mistakes could become lessons and how forgiveness could open the door to change. He didn't talk about the past in detail, but everyone in the room knew what he was referring to. He said, "The measure of an officer isn't in how much authority they have, it's in how much compassion they show." The crowd listened intently. Some nodded, some looked emotional. There was something powerful about seeing the man who had once been wronged standing there in peace, not with resentment, but with understanding. His words carried a calm that touched everyone in the room. After the speech, several young officers approached him. One of them said quietly, "Sir, your story is what made me join the force. I wanted to be part of the change you started." The director smiled and thanked him. He could see the sincerity in their eyes, and that filled him with quiet pride. As the event ended, the chief handed him a plaque engraved with a single line, "For reminding us that respect is the foundation of justice." The director accepted it with gratitude. He didn't see it as a personal award. It was a symbol of growth, of transformation. That evening, as he drove back home, the sun was setting across the open road. The golden light washed over the trees, and for a long stretch he drove in silence. He thought about how much had changed since that day, how something painful had turned into something healing. He realized that sometimes life's hardest moments carry the most important lessons. When he arrived home, he sat by the window with a cup of tea and opened his old notebook, the one he had started writing in after the incident. He flipped through the pages filled with notes, reflections, and quiet realizations. Each line was a piece of the journey. At the end of the notebook, he wrote one final entry. "The strength of a leader is not in how he controls others, but in how he inspires change through calmness." He underlined the last word, calmness. A few months later, the Bureau's annual report highlighted significant progress in national policing standards. Complaints of misconduct had dropped notably in several regions. The report credited new communication initiatives and empathy training as key factors. The director read it with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about taking credit. It was about seeing proof that patience and understanding truly made a difference. One morning, as he arrived at the Bureau, he found a small group of young recruits waiting in the lobby. They had just finished their training and were about to begin field assignments. When they saw him, they stood at attention out of respect. The director smiled warmly and told them to relax. He asked them what they had learned during their training. One of them answered, "We learned that every person we meet has a story, and it's our duty to treat them like we'd want to be treated." The director nodded and said, "If you remember that one thing, you'll do this job right." He shook each of their hands before walking to his office. The hallway was filled with morning light. He moved slowly, not out of fatigue but reflection. The bureau that surrounded him felt different now, warmer, more human. The culture had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Later that day, a close advisor came into his office and asked if he had ever thought about writing a book about his journey. The director smiled softly and said, "Maybe someday, but for now I'd rather let the work speak for itself." He didn't need to tell the world what he had learned. He wanted others to live it, to carry it forward. That night, as he prepared to leave the office, he took one last look around the room. The city outside was glowing with lights, and the quiet hum of traffic filled the air. He closed his briefcase and turned off the lamp on his desk. As he walked toward the elevator, a few agents passing by greeted him with genuine warmth. He returned their smiles, feeling at peace. The elevator doors closed slowly, reflecting his calm face. In that reflection, he didn't see power or authority. He saw purpose. He saw a man who had been tested, humbled, and changed for the better. The next morning, he woke early and took a walk around the city before heading to work. The streets were alive but calm, filled with ordinary people going about their day. He watched a police officer help an elderly man cross the road and couldn't help but smile. It was a small act, but it represented everything he believed in. He stopped by a small coffee shop, ordered his usual, and sat near the window. People moved past on the sidewalks, each carrying their own worries, their own hopes. Watching them, he felt a deep sense of connection. This was why he did what he did. Not for headlines, not for recognition, but for these everyday moments of humanity. As he finished his coffee, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his senior agents. It read, "We just finished a community outreach event. Turnout was huge. The feedback was incredible. Thank you for starting this." The director smiled and replied, "Keep it going. This is only the beginning." Walking back toward his car, he felt the early sunlight on his face. There was a quiet strength in him now, a peace that came from knowing he had turned hardship into hope. The city felt alive, and so did he. When he arrived at the bureau, his assistant greeted him with the day's schedule. But before they began, she said softly, "Sir, I just want to say, it's been an honor working under your leadership. You've changed this place." The director smiled kindly and said, "We've all changed it together." As the day went on, meetings filled his calendar. But even in the busyness, he felt calm. He knew his time as director wouldn't last forever, but the impact would. The programs, the training, the culture, those things would continue long after he left. Before leaving that evening, he looked once more at the plaque from that small-town ceremony sitting on his shelf. He touched it gently and whispered, "This is what real victory looks like." Then he turned off the lights and stepped outside into the fading sunlight. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft colors of dusk. As he walked toward his car, he took one last look at the city skyline, grateful for the journey that had brought him here. From the pain of that morning to the peace of this moment, every step had meant something, and as he drove away, the fading light reflected on his face, a man who had faced injustice and turned it into inspiration, not just for himself, but for an entire nation.